So now the most universal causes are furthest from sense, and particular causes are nearest to sense. They are thus exactly opposed to one another. Now, I think he means opposed not in the sense that they're opposites, but in the sense that they are mutually exclusive, like two sides of the same coin. But they are on the same coin. They have in common the fact that they are a coin side, etc. So universal causes are furthest from the sense. Particular causes are nearest to the sense. In saying that the premises of demonstrated knowledge must be primary, I mean that they must be appropriate basic truths. For I identify primary premise and basic truth. A basic truth in a demonstration is an immediate proposition. An immediate proposition is one which has no other proposition prior to it. A proposition is either part of an enunciation, i.e. it predicates a single attribute of a single subject. If a proposition is dialectical, it assumes either part indifferently. If it is demonstrative, it lays down one part to the definite exclusion of the other, because that part is true. The term enunciation denotes either part of a contradiction indifferently. A contradiction is an opposition which of its own nature excludes a middle. That's a pretty good definition for a contradiction. Now, in case you haven't been paying too much attention over the past paragraph or so, don't worry too much about it, because I should have labeled it a fuzz zone before we went into it. It's a lot of obfuscation explaining a couple of really intricate details. I'm going to try to pretty much read everything, because any little teeny thing I leave out, that will be the only thing that my critics will be able to point to, and they will point to it, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in. So there you go. A contradiction is an opposition which of its own nature excludes a middle. Now here he means contradiction in a different sense. When Ayn Rand says reality has no contradictions, here he means a contradiction, he just means two opposite things or whatever. When one thing contradicts another, goes against, is opposite of. A contradiction is an opposition which of its own nature excludes a middle. So when there's we might call a dichotomy, a contradiction of a dichotomy, but a contradiction not in that negative sense again. Continuing, the part of a contradiction which conjoins a predicate with a subject is an affirmation. The part disjoining them is a negation. Fine, but here, I call an immediate basic truth of syllogism a thesis, when, though it is not susceptible of proof by the teacher, cannot be proven, yet ignorance of it does not constitute a total bar to progress on the part of the pupil. In other words, Aristotle will look at something if it doesn't bar progress by the student, if the student doesn't have to know it. Aristotle, in that case, would say that's a thesis. One which the pupil must know if he is to learn anything whatever is an axiom. He says a thesis is something the student doesn't have to know, and an axiom is the name for that thing which the student has to know. Has to know. I call it an axiom because there are such truths, and we give them the name of axioms par excellence. If a thesis assumes one part or the other of an enunciation, i.e. asserts the existence or non-existence of a subject, it is a hypothesis. If it does not so assert, it is a definition. Definition is a thesis or a laying something down, since the arithmetician lays it down that to be a unit is to be quantitatively indivisible. But it is not a hypothesis, for to define what a unit is not the same as to affirm its existence. So the mathematician talks about what units, their properties or whatever, but doesn't talk about the existence of units. He defines a unit, but doesn't talk about its existence. Now, take that last part for what it's worth. It's good, but the axioms, I think, is the most important bit of that paragraph there. That an axiom he takes to be something the pupil must know to advance. Now, perhaps the pupil doesn't have to know it in the form that a philosopher later in life knows it, but the student has to know it in some form. And I don't believe that Aristotle is here making the case that we have to find these axioms and teach them to the student. He's making the case the student has hold of these axioms, or the student wouldn't be able to advance at all, period. So that's what he's saying about axioms. That's my interpretation. Now, since the required ground of our knowledge, i.e. our conviction of a fact, is the possession of such a syllogism as we call demonstration, and the ground of the syllogism is the facts constituting its premises, we must not only know the primary premises, some if not all of them beforehand, but know them better than the conclusion. That seems obvious to say it that way, but there are philosophers that say things that violate that principle. Now, there's a sentence, it's a fuzz zone, it's just a pretty short sentence, but and then we'll get to a meaningful thing that is an example of it, and it'll concretize for us. So here's the sentence that I can't cut. For the cause of an attribute's inherence in a subject always itself inheres in the subject more firmly than that attribute. Okay, so the cause of the reason for a thing, that cause is more important to the thing acting than the thing that is caused to be valued. Okay, fine. Example given. The cause of our loving anything is dearer to us than the object of our love. That's interesting. I think that's a good insight. The cause of our loving anything is dearer to us than the object of our love. The reason that we love something like the United States, for example. I love the United States because I love freedom and rights and wealth and the individualism. Or why do I love science? I love science because it's objective, it's hard-nosed, it's hard-headed, it's not all about the facts, and whatever it is that causes me to love something. The cause for that, Aristotle says, is dearer than any of the things that it comes out affecting. We could hold that as a pretty true hypothesis. Logically, it seems obviously true, and then we could investigate on that premise, saying if this were true, and look for the truths. Continuing. So since the primary premises are the cause of our knowledge, the primary premises are the information from the five senses. When we get information from the five senses, all of our knowledge is integrations of that in some form or another. Since that is the case, then it is also the case that the knowledge of the latter, the knowledge of things that isn't sensory related, the knowledge of things that comes from integrating the senses, that knowledge is the effect of our knowledge of the premises. It's an effect. So the knowledge of our premises, the five senses, is the cause for all of the other knowledge that is not related directly to the five senses and has to be reduced to the five senses. Now, I wonder if this might be a source of the idea of empiricism. Now, I take empiricism to be that group of scientists in France in the 1800s who resisted knowledge of the atom. They said they wouldn't accept the definition of an atom, the discovery of an atom. They said it was just explanations, that people were just coming up with arbitrary explanations, and we could never know about the existence of atoms because they wouldn't accept anything but empirical evidence, and empirical evidence they held to be stuff they could hit with their five senses. And since you can never get an atom with your five senses, they rejected that humans could ever know anything about them. So, could that be a case for that? I mean, to say that any knowledge except that from our five senses is somehow delusional. Aristotle is just saying that we know the information from our five senses better or best, and that it causes our other knowledge. But could someone somehow delusionally